Between 1618 and 1648, Europe erupted into continuous warfare. Life became so terrifying that a contemporary wrote,
"In our century, and many believe it to be the last,
the 30 Years' War, the first European-wide war in history, a war which mutilated Europe, a war whose horrors were unsurpassed until the world wars of our own century.
One snaps mine. Oh, speak quick, make haste, the soldier's got no time to waste. He must be up and shooting, 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 his leader's enemies uprooting.
During 1938 and 39, the German playwright Bertolt Brecht wrote Mother Courage and Her Children, a chronicle play of the 30 Years' War. Mother Courage follows the armies of both sides with a traveling canteen, selling food, drink, and provisions to the troops. She loses her two sons, Elif and Swiss Cheese, in the war, and her dumb daughter, Katrin, is shot while trying to warn the town of Halle of a surprise attack. Mother Courage is left alone with her wagon, still attending to business and singing her songs.
Here's Mother Courage and her wagon. Hey, Captain, let them come and buy beer by the keg, wine by the flagon. Let your men drink before they die.
We will approach the 30 Years' War in two ways. We will say some of the usual things about which countries were fighting and why, who led them and how, who won and lost, and what the results were. With the help of Brecht's play, we will also get some idea of what the war may have meant to people who were caught up in it, who were forced to come to terms with it to survive.
If war don't suit your disposition, when victory comes you will be dead. War is a business proposition, not with free cheese but steel and lead.
The 30 Years' War, on the face of it, was a war of religion, Catholics against Protestants. But it wasn't quite so simple. The war was more about politics than religion, more about greed than faith. This is a simplified map of Europe in 1618. In red is the Holy Roman Empire, consisting of what is now Germany and Austria, part of what is now Hungary, and the states of Bohemia and Moravia. The empire was traditionally ruled by the Austrian Hapsburgs. The Emperor Matthias, a Catholic, had been crowned at this ceremony in 1612 and was still on the throne in 1618 when the 30 Years' War began. Germany, in 1618, was not yet a unified state. It consisted of more than 300 principalities, duchies, bishoprics, free towns, and cities. There was constant antagonism between the Holy Roman Emperor and the more powerful of the German princes. Nor was the empire united by religion. Some of the princes were Catholics, others were Protestants. The German princes had organized themselves loosely according to religion, into the Protestant Union, headed by Frederick of the Palatinate, and the Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria. In Western Europe, in 1618, the dominant power was Spain, whose territories are shown in yellow. Spanish power was based in part on the wealth of her colonies in the New World. Treasure ships carried huge quantities of gold and silver back to Spain from the mines of Mexico and Peru. The Spanish king, Philip III, was a Habsburg, a cousin of the Holy Roman Emperor. Spain was the most fiercely Catholic country in Europe, and Philip's desire was to wipe the Protestant heresy from the continent. But Spain's rich exterior concealed enormous problems. Following the defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in 1588, Dutch and English pirate ships roamed the Atlantic Ocean, preying on the Spanish treasure fleet. Industry was underdeveloped. Agriculture was in decline. Spain lacked a merchant class to expand her industry and trade. This particular piece of Spanish territory is the Spanish Netherlands. Until the 1560s, Spain had controlled all of the Netherlands, but then the Dutch had revolted, formed the United Provinces of the Netherlands, shown in blue, and had been fighting Spain ever since. In contrast to Spain, industry and trade in the United Provinces was thriving. Dutch ships traded in all the oceans of the world. Amsterdam had become the commercial center of Europe, with a sophisticated international banking system. The majority of Dutchmen lived in towns, where life was civilized and graceful. By the standards of the time, the Dutch enjoyed unprecedented religious freedom. Even Catholics were tolerated in this Protestant country, as long as they practiced their faith discreetly. France, shown in green, had been engaged for over a century in a desperate struggle against encirclement by the Hapsburgs. For between them, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire threatened her entire frontier. In 1618, France was weak and disunited. A young king, Louis XIII, sat helplessly on the throne while his nobles competed for power. Not until the 1620s, when the 30 Years' War was already underway, did France pull together under the guiding hand of Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to Louis XIII. France, like Spain, was a Catholic country, but for Richelieu, religion took second place to politics.
In foreign affairs, my lord, you must have a continuing plan to stop the advance of Spain, but without causing open war, until we are ready.
Until 1635, France was to fight the war by diplomacy and by financing the armies of her allies. The war also involved the countries of Northern and Eastern Europe. Poland, shown in purple, was the world's greatest producer and exporter of grain. On the opposite shore of the Baltic Sea was the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, shown in brown, and Sweden, shown in orange. These countries were in continual conflict over control of the Baltic trading ports, which dealt mainly in food and industrial raw materials destined for Western Europe. Local wars for control of the rich Baltic trade became a matter of crucial importance to all the participants in the 30 Years' War. The war is about to begin.
Christians rise, the winter's come, the world awaits the Dead Sea calm. And though you may not long survive, strap on your swords and look alive.
Strap on your swords and look alive. But war in the 17th century was very different from war today. And before the 30 Years' War begins, we should note some of the differences. Governments of the time considered it too dangerous to give arms to their own peasants. Many soldiers in the early 17th century, therefore, were mercenaries, men who offered their services to the highest bidder. Mercenaries usually refused to wear uniforms, except perhaps a colored scarf that would identify them to their comrades. They wanted to be ready to change sides if things went badly, or if their pay was overdue. Discipline was almost non-existent. Mercenaries regarded it as their right to supplement their pay by plundering conquered areas. By modern standards, mercenary armies were small, and were therefore unable to hold conquered territory for long. Because mercenary troops had to live off the land, their presence often provoked uprisings by the people they had just conquered.
Your blessing, priest, be quick. Make haste, the soldier's got no time to waste. He must be up and doing, daring, dying, his leader's greatness glorifying.
The 30 Years' War began in Bohemia. an area with a special constitutional position within the Holy Roman Empire. Whoever was elected king of Bohemia became next in line for the imperial throne in Vienna. In many ways, Bohemian society resembled that of the Netherlands. The Bohemians were Protestants, but were tolerant of other faiths. Their capital city, Prague, was a major European cultural center. In 1617, the Holy Roman Emperor persuaded Bohemian nobles to elect the Hapsburg Archduke Ferdinand as their king, despite his reputation as a fanatical Catholic. When Ferdinand began a ruthless anti-Protestant campaign throughout his new domain, the Bohemians rose in revolt. The revolution began with an event known as the defenestration of Prague. Officials appointed by Vienna were thrown from the windows of Hradčin Castle. Shortly after the revolution began, the Holy Roman Emperor Matthias died and was succeeded by Archduke Ferdinand. The Bohemians now needed a new king, and this time they elected the head of the Protestant Union, Frederick of the Palatinate, King of Bohemia. The Bohemians began the war well, advancing to the gates of Vienna. But they were forced to retreat when Bavaria and Saxony, two of the most powerful states in Germany, intervened on the emperor's behalf. The forces of the Catholic League finally routed the Bohemians in November 1620 at the Battle of White Mountain, and Protestant Bohemia came to an end. During 1620, the peasants of Bohemia had been in revolt, as both armies, friend and foe alike, pillaged their land. Meanwhile, Mother Courage's brave son, Aleph, has been conscripted into the Protestant forces, and he tells his commander, and the company chaplain, how he dealt with the peasants.
Well, it was like this. I found out the peasants had hidden their oxen and, on the sly, and chiefly at night, had driven them into a certain wood. The people from the town were to pick them up there. I let them get their oxen in peace. Well, they ought to know better than me where they are, I said to myself. Meanwhile, I made my men crazy for meat. Their rations were short, and I made sure they got shorter.
Smart fella.
Not bad. The rest was a walkover. Only the peasants had clubs, and outnumbered us 3-1 and made a murderous attack on us. 4 of them drove me into a clump of trees, knocked my good sword from my hand, and yelled surrender. What now, I said to myself, they'll make mincemeat of me.
What did you do?
I laughed.
You what?
I laughed. So we got talking. I came right to business and I said, 20 guilders an ox is too much. I bid 15. Like I wanted to buy. That foxed them. So while they were scratching their heads, I reached for my good sword and cut them to pieces. Necessity knows no law, eh?
What do you say, shepherd of the flock?
Strictly speaking, that saying is not in the Bible. Our Lord made 500 loaves out of 5, so that no such necessity would arise. When he told men to love their neighbours, their bellies were full. Nowadays, things are different.
When he loves his breath comes easy, and sure his hand is strong. No, he never fears at all. The foe is fleeing, falling, and he marches on. Death and darkness he is called.
Protestant forces in Western Europe at first fared little better than the Bohemians. Spanish armies inflicted heavy defeats on the troops of the Protestant Union. In 1626, the Dutch fortress at Breda, on the border of the United Provinces, fell to the Spanish. This painting by Velázquez depicts the Dutch surrender. The Spanish now turned their attention toward Poland and the Baltic ports. If the Habsburgs could seize control of the Baltic, the United Provinces would be cut off from supplies of food and raw materials. Back in Vienna, however, Emperor Ferdinand was changing his military plans. Thus far he had relied on the troops of the Catholic League, supplied and paid for by Maximilian of Bavaria. But both Ferdinand and the Spanish were suspicious of Maximilian's ambitions. To free himself from dependence on Maximilian, Ferdinand needed his own army. To get it, he turned to Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian who had turned Catholic. Wallenstein was a combination of successful general and ruthless businessman, a useful combination in the 30 Years' War. Wallenstein recruited, armed, paid, fed, and commanded Ferdinand's troops. And he raised, on Ferdinand's behalf, a colossal army of 40,000 men. This army was a strange and terrifying sight. Moving across the land like a swarm of locusts, the troops plundered, raped, and burned, regardless of whether they were on friendly or hostile soil. Homeless peasants swelled the army, bringing with them wives and children, until the 40,000 troops were accompanied by 140,000 camp followers.
Your body, girl, be quick. Make haste, the soldier's got no time to waste. He must be up and hitting, hiding, hating. He cannot keep his leaders waiting.
Wallenstein's army soon swept the Protestant forces out of northern Germany. When the army moved on to seize the duchies of Pomerania and Mecklenburg, Spanish dreams came true. The Habsburgs had gained control of the Baltic trade. Wallenstein's war was conducted in the fashion of the times. He was prepared to sell military supplies to anyone who would pay, even to his enemies, the Dutch. Nor was he alone in this curious morality. The Dutch loaned Wallenstein large sums of money.
I'm letting you have the bullets for 2 guilders. Dirt cheap, because I need the money. The colonel's been drinking with the officers for 3 days, and we run out of liquor.
They're army property. If they find him on me, I'll be court-martialed. You sell your bullets, you bastards, and send your men out to fight with nothing to shoot with?
Oh, come on. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
I won't take army stuff. Not at that price.
You can resell 'em for 5 guilders, maybe 8, to the ordnance officer of the 4th Regiment. All you have to do is give him a receipt for 12. He hasn't a bullet left.
Why don't you do it yourself?
I don't trust him. We're friends.
The Habsburgs and Emperor Ferdinand had achieved their moment of triumph. But political intrigues soon undermined military victories. Ferdinand, flushed with success, tried to increase his power over the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The princes quickly overcame their religious differences and threatened to ally with France against Ferdinand unless he got rid of Wallenstein, the source of his independent power. Ferdinand gave way. He dismissed Wallenstein and gave command of his armies back to Wallenstein's predecessor, the Bavarian general Tilly. As the fruits of victory were being torn from Ferdinand's grasp, the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, landed his Protestant army on German soil.
From town to town, cross field and river, the army always moves ahead. It seems the war could last forever, as long as there is steel and lead. But lead and steel can't follow orders. They do what men can make them do. Report today to your headquarters. If it's the last this war needs you.
By 1630, the Catholic armies of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain had driven Protestant forces out of northern Germany and had gained control of the Baltic trading ports. At this moment of triumph, however, the Holy Roman Empire was undermined from within. German princes, fearful that the government in Vienna might grow too strong, forced Emperor Ferdinand to dismiss Albrecht von Wallenstein, his most able general. As Wallenstein retired to his estates in Bohemia, the Protestant king of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, landed his army in Germany. Gustavus Adolphus had several motives for intervening in the 30 Years' War. On the one hand, he was a devout Protestant, and had often expressed his desire to free Europe from the yoke of Rome. He was also interested in giving Sweden permanent control of the Baltic trade, and in making northern Germany a buffer zone between Sweden and the Catholic countries to the south. When Gustavus landed in Germany and took control of the Baltic coastline, a new era in warfare began. Gustavus's army was the first real national army in Europe, raised by universal conscription within Sweden itself. Unlike most of the common people in Europe, Swedish peasants were prepared to fight for their king, who had often supported their interests against the Swedish nobility. Gustavus Adolphus could thus depend on the personal loyalty of his troops. He also devised a number of significant innovations in military strategy and technology. At the beginning of the 17th century, the art of killing people in war was a primitive business. Firearms had replaced bows and arrows, but they were inaccurate and heavy, with a painfully slow rate of fire. At this stage in the development of firearms, the longbow was still a more efficient weapon. The usual infantry formation, as perfected by the Spanish, was a huge block of 1,600 men, with pikemen in the middle, surrounded by musketeers. But this was a clumsy battle formation, difficult to maneuver, and mercenary pikemen were notoriously reluctant to charge the enemy. Gustavus Adolphus broke his infantry into small mobile units, under the command of officers who had the authority to seize a tactical advantage if one was presented. Most crucial, however, was the manner in which the Swedes used artillery. The Swedish iron industry perfected a light mobile cannon, which could be moved across the battlefield as needed. To an enemy accustomed to the old static methods of warfare, these new techniques and the ferocity of the native Swedish troops were devastating. Meanwhile, the Catholic forces, now under the command of General Tilly, were in a desperate situation. With much of Germany in ruins, Tilly was forced to rely on Wallenstein for food and supplies. But Wallenstein, since his dismissal, was uncooperative. Tilly was left to find provisions for his troops as best he could. The capture of the wealthy German city of Magdeburg, which favored Gustavus Adolphus, seemed to be the answer. Magdeburg refused to surrender and was taken by force. According to the conventions of war, it was then given over to the soldiers to be sacked. But the murder of thousands of men, women, and children by the starving conquerors was soon overshadowed by a more fearful catastrophe. Somehow a fire started, and soon the entire town was engulfed in a roaring conflagration. The Swedish blamed Tilly, but he was almost certainly innocent, for with the destruction of Magdeburg, Tilly lost the means of supporting his troops. Nevertheless, many German princes, outraged by Magdeburg, flocked to support Gustavus Adolphus. The final clash occurred at Breitenfeld, where the superior tactics of the Swedes spelled doom for Tilly's forces. 12,000 of Tilly's troops were killed. Another 7,000 were prisoners in the Swedish camp that night, and soldiers in the Swedish army by morning.
And some did deeds they took a pride in. Some slyly sought their lives to save. They hollowed out a hole to hide in, but only dug an early grave.
Germany now lay at the mercy of the Protestant allies. Gustavus Adolphus marched south, and in 1632 entered Nuremberg in triumph. Nothing, it seemed, could prevent him from taking Vienna. Then a desperate Emperor Ferdinand recalled Wallenstein to the command of the Catholic armies. As the winter of 1632 began, Wallenstein moved into Saxony, intending to keep his forces there until spring. But Gustavus Adolphus startled Europe by attacking in the depths of winter. The Battle of Lutzen raged all day. At nightfall, with both armies exhausted and neither side victorious, Wallenstein withdrew toward Bohemia. The Swedes claimed victory. They had, however, paid a terrible price. Gustavus Adolphus was dead. His body was found naked under a mound of corpses.
The funeral procession is just starting out.
Pity about the chief getting killed that way. Say it was an accident. There was fog over the fields that morning, and the fog was to blame. The chief called up another regiment, told him to fight to the death, rode back again, missed his way in the fog, went forward instead of back, and ran smack into a bullet in the thick of battle. It's a disgrace the way you're all skipping your commander's funeral.
They should have handed the money out before the funeral. Now the men are all getting drunk instead of going to it.
Don't you have to be there?
I, stayed away because of the rain.
It's different for you. The rain might spoil your uniform. Here they wanted to ring the bells for his funeral, which is natural. But it came out that the churches had been shut up by his orders. So the poor commander won't be hearing any bells when they lower him in his grave. Instead, they'll fire off 3 shots, so the occasion won't be too sober.
With the death of Gustavus Adolphus in 1632, the way seemed open for a general pacification. Most German princes made peace with the Emperor Ferdinand. But Wallenstein was not yet ready for peace. For him, war was a profitable business. He began secret negotiations with Sweden, proposing that the Holy Roman Empire be carved up between them. Ferdinand could no longer afford to trust his chief warlord. On the emperor's orders, Wallenstein was murdered. War was resumed against the Swedes. Many rulers in Europe feared a total victory for either Sweden or the Holy Roman Empire, for whoever won such a victory would be dangerously strong. Therefore, when the Swedes suffered a heavy defeat at the hands of a combined Spanish and Imperial army, Cardinal Richelieu of France decided it was time to enter the struggle. In May 1635, France declared war on Spain. From this point on, the 30 Years' War was a contest between France and Spain, for Germany and Central Europe were devastated and exhausted. Warfare continued there sporadically, but the population was in decline, and the survivors were in a state of helpless misery.
I've had enough, Mother Courage. I didn't tell you. A letter came from Utrecht. My mother's died of cholera. The inn is mine. There's a letter if you don't believe me.
I'm tired of wandering too. I feel like a butcher's dog taking meat to my customers and getting none myself. I've nothing more to sell and people have nothing to pay with. In Saxony, someone tried to saddle me with a chest full of books in return for 2 eggs. And in Württemberg, They let me have their plough for a bag of salt. Nothing grows anymore, only thorn bushes. In Pomerania, I hear their villages have been eating their younger children. Nuns have been caught committing robbery.
The world's dying out.
Sometimes I see myself driving through hell with this wagon and selling brimstone. And sometimes I'm driving through heaven handing out provisions to wandering souls. If only we could find a place where there's no shooting. Me and my children. What's left of them. We might rest a while.
The contrast between France and Spain, as the two countries prepared for a final clash, was striking. While the rest of Europe had been bleeding to death, France had grown prosperous. Cardinal Richelieu had promoted industry and trade, and the idea of a unified nation, strengthening the power of the king over that of his nobles, and subordinating even religious differences to this end. In Spain, on the other hand, agriculture was decaying, and industry had never really gotten started. The demands of continual warfare made it increasingly difficult for the Spanish king to command the loyalty of his nobles. The Spanish were defeated by the French at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643. Soon afterward, the provinces of Catalonia and Portugal rose in revolt. From this time on, Spanish power in the world declined. Slowly throughout Europe, hostilities ground to a halt. On February 8, 1649, the 30 Years' War came to an end, with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. Eilif, Mother Courage's brave son, has again vanquished a group of peasants. But this time there is a difference. The war has just ended.
What has he done?
He broke in on a peasant. The wife is dead.
Eilif, how could you?
It's no difference what I did before.
That was in wartime.
It's true. In wartime, they honoured him for it. He sat at the commander's right hand. It was bravery. Couldn't we speak with the provost?
What's the use? Stealing cattle from a peasant, what's brave about that?
It was just stupid.
If I'd been stupid, I'd have starved.
So you were bright and paid for it.
What shall we tell your mother?
Tell her it was no different. Tell her it was the same. Oh, tell her nothing.
Now he's gone. When he left, his breath came easy. Warm and sure, his hand was strong. Now he never breathes alone. His blood is freezing, falling, all his senses gone. When he left his blood, his blood, he's never bleeds, he never bleeds as though his blood is bleeding, gone. Death throws darkness down, through darkness down, he's gone.
The 30 Years' War, for all its destruction, was a turning point in European history. The countries of Europe shook off their feudal past and turned in the direction of modern nationalism and capitalism. France emerged as the most powerful and unified state in Europe, its frontiers secure, poised on the threshold of the golden age of French nationalism, the age of King Louis XIV. The Netherlands finally won total independence from Spain and became a major power, with modern political institutions and an economy developing rapidly in the direction of capitalism. For almost 100 years, Sweden remained a great power. Control of the Baltic trade added the necessary financial security to Swedish military prowess. The Holy Roman Empire, with its different national groups, began slowly to dissolve, eventually becoming the Central European state known as Austria-Hungary. Much of Germany was economically crippled by the war, but the states of Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia emerged with strong national identities. Although it took another 2 centuries, Prussia was eventually to unite all of Germany in a single state. The country that suffered most was Bohemia, where the 30 Years' War had started. The land and population were decimated. Bohemia's culture was in ruins, and the religious freedom Bohemians had once enjoyed was a thing of the past.
With blood and fire and devastation, the war has passed this way and gone. It took away one generation, and yet somehow some life goes on. Starvation, cold and filth enslave us. Our rulers rob us of our pay. Only a miracle can save us, and miracles have had their day.
Historians are often more interested in the doings of emperors, kings, and generals than in the fate of the common people. Their history is only beginning to be written, and there are still huge gaps in our knowledge of how they lived. We do know that common people in the 17th century rarely felt any strong allegiance to king or country. Their lives were bounded by the day-to-day events of their own locality. Even in periods of peace, a peasant's life was hard. More than half his crops went in taxes to the crown, the church, and the local lord. An increase in taxes or a poor harvest could mean starvation. During the 30 Years' War, taxes increased continually. Desperate peasants were often driven to revolt against their oppressors. One such revolt began in Normandy in France in the summer of 1639. War taxation was making life unbearable, and a so-called friendly army was looting and burning what little the peasants had left. By the winter of 1639, an army of barefoot peasants was roaming through Normandy, 20,000 strong, armed with picks and scythes. But the peasants did not know how to use their power. They could only destroy, until they were slaughtered by an army from Paris. Leaders of the revolt were executed. As if death through warfare, starvation, or plague were not enough, the 30 Years' War saw the rise of a witch hunt unequaled in history. Thousands of men, women, and children were accused of being witches, and were tortured or burned alive. Both Catholics and Protestants were guilty of gruesome excesses. It is not surprising that the 30 Years' War haunted the minds of the common people of Europe. Until, in our own century, it receded before the even greater horrors of the Somme, Passchendaele, Dresden, Auschwitz, and Hiroshima.
Christians arise, the winter's gone.